A warm welcome to everyone for this session where we're going to be looking at ways in which we can work together to improve research integrity. I'm Elizabeth Moylan. I work at BMC and my role there is to support peer review strategy and innovation. And I'm also a volunteer at COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. And I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by our three panellists with a range of backgrounds and experience. So we've got Katie Glonty, who is a PhD student. She's based at the University of Split and also the University of Paris Dakar, my amateur French. We also have Benjamin Schlueter-Buchler, who heads the Computational Genomics Group at the Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research at the University of Oxford. And then James Parry here, who is the Chief Executive of UK RIO, the UK Research Integrity Office. And we've just heard in the lightning talks earlier about the benefits of research that's done well with integrity, and we all imply that research integrity yields results that are beneficial, they're trustworthy, they're valid, and they've been conducted in the right manner. And that's all well and good, but a few of you may be aware of a report that came out a couple of years ago now, December 2014, into the culture of scientific research in the UK. And if anybody wants copies of that report, they're available at the front desk, which just drew attention to some of the sort of pressures that are put on researchers that can sort of fuel perverse incentives and sort of undermine some of the best practice in research integrity. So the way this session is going to run, we're going to hear the sort of issue that resonates with the three panellists for between 3 to 5 minutes, and then we're going to take questions and have discussion. So Katie, if you don't mind kicking us off with your issue.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I was going to talk about training. So as a young researcher, I feel like I get a lot of training. I get a lot of opportunities to be trained in different aspects. But I kind of feel that it's not trickling down to different levels, like the institutional level or senior levels. And just to give you two specific examples. So our funder, Marie Curie, asks us to submit a data management plan. And I got excellent training on how to get through the data management plan and fill in each and every section. But then when it comes to practicalities, going back to your institution and try to figure out of how to manage your data, basically, it gets a little bit more complicated because it seems that not everyone was trained as me and not everyone knows where things are going, basically. And the second point that I wanted to make was about questionable research practices. So again, I had really good training on this. We had scenario games. We got a lot of support giving us specific action points on how to deal with questionable research practices. And I feel really empowered to deal with them, but I feel like this is not happening to senior staff. So you, as a young researcher, you're equipped to deal with questionable practices, but it's really, the burden is really up to you and not to the senior people that should be trained as well, basically.
Okay. Thank you, Katie, that's lovely. So we're going to hold questions for Katie, but we're going to move on to hear what Benjamin's point of view is. Thanks.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. I totally agree with what Katie was saying. So my personal perspective is obviously different a little bit in the sense that I'm now a group leader myself, so I'm responsible for what other people do in my group and people that I supervise. As such, I think that there's a lot of things that we could talk about when we talk about research integrity, but the issue that that is particularly close to my heart and that I feel in some ways is most addressable and most solvable at the moment is the problem of what I would call sort of accidental misconduct. So what do I mean with accidental misconduct? I'll give you an example of something that has happened in my group that I've sort of observed firsthand. So some years ago, I was supervising a student, co-supervising a student who was working on a large project. He was getting towards the end of his funding. The project seemed to be going well. We had a manuscript in preparation. We were getting towards the end of creating that paper, and we're going to send it off very soon. This project had taken several years and had gone through many, many iterations. He kept sending emails back and forth, you know, oh, can you try it this way, can you try it that way, have you looked at this data, have you looked at that data? And so, you know, by the end of it, we had the manuscript, I read through it literally like a few days before I was thinking of sending it off, and I suddenly realized that this figure just doesn't quite match anymore what we had described in the text. And I was initially quite furious because I thought, I mean, how could he have missed that point? But really, I think what has happened there was that in this process of iterating, at some point, the description of what was in the text and the figure that he had created just came out of sync. And I'm not sure whether he was too afraid to point it out because it was so close towards the end of his funding, or whether this was because subconsciously he just didn't want to reread the manuscript for the 100th time, but somehow this error just slipped in, and it could have been a really embarrassing thing to do, or it could have ruined the paper, really. So luckily we caught that one, but it led me to sort of think about how can this problem and related issues of communication within the lab during the evolution of a research project, how can that be improved? So I mean, I have a background in technology, so I thought there must be a technological solution to this. So about a year ago, I set up a project in Oxford that is now funded by the university at the moment, that we call Methodicate. It's currently in beta. And what Methodicate is trying to do is create a platform to improve the communication between scientists within a research group during the evolution of a project, and capture both the thought process that goes into the project and all the file versions of the various data, code, and results that are being generated over the years. So I believe that through this kind of technology, this and maybe other technological advances that are currently being rolled out, we will eventually be able, I think, to hopefully improve or reduce the number of these kind of accidental cases of misconduct that are currently happening.
Great, thank you. So, a role for technology in the process. James, if you don't mind giving us your perspective, that would be lovely.
Thank you. Okay, the UK Research Integrity Office is a charity that advises on good research practice. We're basically a helpline for stressed researchers, research organisations and members of the public, including patients and participants, with questions or concerns about research, how to get things right, what to do if problems occur, what to do if something's gone wrong and you suspect fraud has taken place. When discussions take place on breaches of research integrity, we often naturally gravitate to the big cases of fraud, because that's kind of exciting stuff, almost the sort of sexy stuff. It's certainly stuff that grabs the headline in the academics and mainstream media. But if you look at the spectrums of concerns there are about whether researchers are getting it right or wrong, the biggest area of concern is, as has been touched upon already, honest error, the fact we're human, we're fallible, we make mistakes. Call it unluck, call it recklessness, but there's a broad amount of studies which just don't have integrity because people are getting it wrong. At the far end of that spectrum, you've got the cases of research fraud, the headline-grabbing stuff that no university, no lab ever wants to happen under their auspices. And it is more common than many people would like to think. In the middle, you have, and again we touched upon this already, those questionable research practices. You could define those as deliberately sloppy research, so playing games with authorship, leaving your outliers off your published figures because you're saying they make it look messy. And those issues and the issues of sloppiness, I think, are the ones that we need to focus on. When you think about it, the basic standards for research seem very straightforward. Don't just make stuff up. Stealing the work of others is wrong. Please be nice to your research participants. Embezzling research funds is generally frowned on. So the thinking goes, this stuff is self-evident, and therefore it kind of takes care of itself. But at UK RIO and internally within research organisations, there are so many questions and concerns about how to get things right. Research, regardless of the discipline, it's analog rather than digital. It's sort of nuance and shades of grey. And I think we need to ask ourselves, are we teaching researchers what they need to know? Or are they picking things up as they go along? And if it's the latter, are they picking up good habits or bad? And also, to echo what's been said already, in terms of training, even if training's hitting certain targets, is it trickling down in some cases up to the entirety of teams and departments and schools? I think the long training only gets you so far. A compliance culture only gets you so far. I think the long-term issues have to come out of culture and leadership.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So we've got the different perspectives there in terms of training, technology, and changing the culture. And before we just start taking questions from the audience, I just wondered, what are the sort of positive incentives that maybe you've seen in operation, and maybe the audience has seen them in operation too, that can start to sort of change the culture, which is the thing that, you know, the Nuffield Council also really emphasised, that this it's a cultural issue, and how are we going to change the culture? Has anybody got any thoughts on that?
Thank you. I mean, there is an argument that you have to be careful how you incentivize this stuff, because the view goes, you shouldn't, good research practice is sort of an inherent part of the profession of being a researcher, and you shouldn't pat people on the back just for doing the basic standards of their profession. I do get that argument, but I do think we can look at rewarding people going above and beyond the norm. I mean, declare a conflict of interest. I chair the launch of the Nuffield Council report, and I've done a lot of follow-up work on it. And the REF and those other methods of research assessment are naturally a source of stress and contribute to that publish or perish culture. But if we can move away from looking at people's citation counts and grant applications, and also perhaps measure and reward people who can be shown to have really gone above and beyond the norm in terms of research ethics and integrity, that could be helpful. Some institutions, Glasgow's one, have a research integrity champion role, people who sit within departments and schools, who are there for sources of advice for researchers, who can help take concerns up the ladder if something serious happens. Rewarding people to undertake those roles could be useful. Or when teams have informal arrangements to sort of check each other's working and those sorts of things, sort of build collaborative support networks outside the normal university structures. That's something helpful. So I think we need to expect basic standards of research, but if people go above and beyond that, we should incentivize it. At the moment, all we do is disincentivize breaches of research integrity by saying, if you commit fraud, we will hammer you. And yes, that's important, but most people here, I suspect, aren't going to wake up tomorrow morning and say, I know, I'm going to fake all my data. But you will be tempted to collaborate with people who play fast and loose with things. You will have colleagues saying, oh, we should put Professor so-and-so down as a co-author because they'll help us get our paper published, even when they've had no involvement in the research. So I think people who can stand up for research integrity above and beyond the norm or in difficult circumstances should be rewarded.
Great. Thank you. We've got a question at the back. I think the microphone's on its way.
Thank you. You said directly that lack of research integrity is being imposed indirectly by politicians and directly by senior scientists. I have a lot of time for the first speaker who came close to saying that, but not quite so blunt. Being old, I can afford to say it. It is actually really serious. The people are incentivized directly to cut corners and in order to get lots of publications. And until that stops, it'll continue to go on as it is, which is rather dodgy, I'm afraid. It would also help if people understood p-values, but that's another question. That's a mere detail. The fact that most people still think it's the probability that your results would occur by chance can account for at least 25% of the wrong results in the literature. That's just a detail. What matters is the pressure put on people to behave badly, rather direct pressure.
So there is a House of Commons inquiry at the moment going on into research integrity, and they are listening to evidence from a range of institutions and UK RIO, so that's good that this has been taken seriously at government level. What's your question, please? Thank you.
I'm just going to ask the whole panel, what more do you think could be done to help enforce research integrity?
So I think I might be able to answer or address both of these issues. I think on the one hand, the incentive structure is, I totally agree, on many levels, toxic. Whether we're going to change that, and certainly whether I am going to change that as an individual researcher is doubtful. I mean, this is a long-term process. It will require collaboration, I believe, of funders, politics, a lot of leaders in the field. However, what we can do, I think, is we can improve the standards of reporting. We can make research better documented. We can encourage people or even require people to, I think, give us more insight in how they actually came up with their results, which I think would at least make it harder to fake things, basically.
No, I mean, firstly, I would agree with David. As I said, I was involved in that report, and it clearly points out the pressures in the system. And that report is about scientific research in the UK, but I think it strikes a chord, it will strike a chord with people from other countries. And also, my background's in archaeology, so arts, a bit sciencey, but it sits in the arts and humanities, and that definitely spoke to me. So I would urge you to read the report. It does explain the pressures that exist, and unfortunately, changing those will need concerted work from funders, government, publishers, every actor in the system. I think there is a tendency for each group of people, research organisations, publishers and like, to say, well, we're doing loads, it's up to other people to make the next move. And I think there needs to be big collaboration. That's sort of dealing with stuff on the macro level. On the micro level, I think you're absolutely right. It's about encouraging people to show their working, if you will, and also have an environment where there should be no... In some ways, it's a shame that my charity has to exist to provide a helpline, because often we get questions that people could ask their colleagues, but they feel they'll look stupid doing so, or if they're whistleblowing about a problem, that they'll be ostracised, be sent to Coventry. There should be an atmosphere where there's no such thing as a stupid question. There should be no stigma attached to people who recognise they need help, because even if they've messed up, asking for help is much better than the alternative.
I think at institutional level, at universities, there should be a stronger research integrity team. So usually you come across them once a year when they give the ethics workshop, but perhaps this could be sort of, they could do a better job, or to bring people together and discuss issues that are happening all the time.
And it's at all levels as well, isn't it? It's not just the PhD cohort that's coming in, it's also sort of refreshers for existing staff as well, I think, so that they know what are the issues that you're talking about with respect to authorship. Next question, please. Where should we go?
I've got the mic over here already.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So I've kind of got two questions, so I'm going to try and do them quickly. One is, if you are, for example, a junior researcher or a PhD student, and your supervisor is asking you to do research in a way that you believe is against best practice, for example, and could lead to problems in the future, how would you recommend improving the confidence of, for example, a young researcher to speak up about those things? Because I think those issues happen a lot, but it's acting on them. How do you improve that? And I guess the second question, I can't remember what it was now, so actually just stick with that one.
So I don't think you should be going into a conflict. Actually, at some universities, you have 2 or 3 supervisors. So this is the best way for the PhD student. You let the seniors deal with this issue, because it's likely that someone else will disagree with this practice of the other senior researchers. So just having a team of supervisors, 2 or 3 people, might take away the burden from the PhD student of dealing with such difficult issues.
I would actually completely mirror these comments. I think that I've seen these things happen actually in very similar ways, and I think that the crucial thing is to have someone else, to bring in another more senior person who, hopefully, either you will find out that they will say, well, actually, no, that's more or less okay, you're sort of overreacting, which can also be, or they will say, well, that is a problem, and maybe you can convince them to have a 3-way conversation.
I'd echo what's already been said. Of course, sometimes there can be weaknesses in the system. Chatham House, we had a case recently where a PhD student was in the position you described, and they had 2 supervisors, but the 2 supervisors were married to each other, so tended to take each other's side. But there'll be other people you can talk to. You go to the chair of the ethics committee in your department. There will be somewhere in your university also a policy for raising concerns about research, which you could do formally, and that's obviously a big step. But there'll be a research integrity officer or a clerk to the ethics committee. The name and title will vary, but there'll be people in the central university departments who you can also go to, and they may be able to effect a direct resolution or direct you to other resources. And in a shameless piece of self-promotion, there's also the UK Research Integrity Office. Do Google us sometime.
Great. Who's got the mic? Yeah.
So a couple of questions as well. So tagging along onto that, it strikes me that you're here and you report some, things that happened. And actually, I find a lot of researchers, like for you, Benjamin, like you telling us about something that was a near miss and that you saved. And it's brilliant because we can all learn from it. But often I find in research, there's this shame about these near misses, things that could have gone bad, and it's easy to sweep them under the rug. So my first question is, how do you overcome that? And then my second question is maybe more for UK Ryo, because you used a soundbite, if I can use something that the brilliant speaker told us about speeches earlier. You used honest error, and that's really powerful, I find, in shifting the thinking about misconduct. Because misconduct sounds bad. Honest error sounds much more acceptable, and we can talk about it. So how much are you developing language around that to help the discussion?
Possibly my answer would be related to your second question. I mean, I guess there is an issue about how we speak about these near misses or honest errors. Yeah, I'm not sure I really have a good answer to that. I believe that, maybe it's because I'm younger than some of my other colleagues, or maybe it's because I work in, computational field where, to my sense at least, there is more of a culture of openness. Yeah, I mean, I think this will hopefully change also with time, people's attitude towards being honest about, what works and what didn't work.
I would say there is a move towards a culture of openness. If you think about the average researcher's attitudes towards, say, open access these days, it's dramatically shifted from what it was 5, 10, 20 years ago. Against that, you can say that the pressures on researchers from the system of how grants are awarded, monitored, funded, how research is disseminated, have arguably increased proportionally as well. So we're better off than we were in some respects and worse off in other respects. I do think a culture of openness is the way to go. People make mistakes. People do execute research projects perfectly, but get a negative answer. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you have a good research question, the right methods to pursue that question, and you operate those methods accurately, whatever result you get is a good one. Now, I'm not sure the ref assessors would necessarily agree with me, and I think a lot of people in charge of ref submissions would not necessarily agree with me, but I say good research is a good question, well designed and well executed. And yes, it may not be nice to get a result that isn't groundbreaking and exciting, that won't go on the front page of Nature, but it's still a good result if you've pursued it correctly. You've added to knowledge. Okay, we know the answer to that question is in this method is a no. But I think if we can have that, it's culture, it's about openness, and I hope that as researchers take these ideas on board early in their research careers and then go onwards and upwards, we can see that cultural change within institutions. But it's going to be a long piece of work. And just to answer very quickly your second point, I think, yes, honest errors are mistakes and we all make them, so that's a good way of talking about it. Deliberate fraud, I think we should still categorise that as deliberate fraud, but I think even their institutions need to be more open about what they've had to deal with and what steps they've taken to correct the problems and reduce the chances of them happening again.
Great. Next question. There's one at the back.
Ben Bleaser from the Wellcome Trust. Building on that last question and going a little bit further perhaps, how do we talk to the public about these sorts of issues, considering that a lot of taxpayers' money and donations flow into research? We've talked a lot about how we talk across researchers about that, and even the language there is important. I think it's even more important with the public. And how do we frame this in a way that people can understand the challenges?
Do you want to... I feel I can pitch in. It's a little bit about how research is perceived, isn't it? And it's a messy business, and research is about testing a question and not quite knowing the answer, and that there's an inherent messiness there, and mistakes happen. But as long as we can correct those mistakes as we go and make sure the public are informed, I think that's helpful. But perhaps we don't want to hold research up to be this holy grail. It's always going to work perfectly. There are different avenues that people go down. Yeah.
I would agree. I mean, I think the issue is that there's a natural tendency in the media for obvious reasons, to try and have stories that resonate. So I mean, it goes both ways. I mean, if you have a story that says researchers discover new tests for breast cancer, you know, it sounds fantastic. What they might have actually done is something much more complicated and much less clear whether it's really going to work that way, but, you know, that's the headline. And then the next day you might find a, you know, headline that says, you know, breast cancer research proven to be wrong, something like that. It's like, well, what actually happened is that maybe someone found out that there was an error in their, you know, calculations somewhere. But yeah, I mean, I don't know whether there really is a way to break that cycle other than hopefully increasing scientific literacy in the population in general, understanding how does research work. You know, these are people, these are you know, things that evolve over time, and each incremental step shouldn't be taken as, you know, the leap to the moon, but these are, you know, steps.
I mean, these days there is considerable interest from the public on whether researchers are getting it right or wrong, and everyone likes reading about a juicy scandal or so-called scandal in the papers. You're absolutely right. Part of this is how science is reported, and there are people such as Ben Goldacre and others have noted issues with how versed in science are many science reporters or people tasked by the papers to report on science, and then you get certain papers which are in the same issue will report on one page that red wine cures cancer, another page that red wine causes cancer. I think we all know which paper I'm talking about. There's also an issue that I think we have to bear in mind, that public trust in any profession these days is somewhat fragile. MPs had their problem with the expenses scandals, journals with Leveson, and it's probably going to happen to researchers sooner or later. We can't sit in our ivory towers anymore. I think we have to go out and engage and be open about the challenges that we face, show our working, that be transparent. And also bear in mind, an awful lot of stuff research isn't accessible to the public because you have to have a subscription to the journal. This is not a call for publishers and their representatives to throw everything open immediately, but if we want the public to trust us, they have to be able to see our research outputs, because as you said, they're often funded by public money, directly or indirectly.
Great, we've got another question. Oh, sorry, the lady with the mic, and then maybe we'll go to you.
Okay, so this is a response to Benjamin's point about the increasing scientific literacy of the population. And I think it's our responsibility as scientists to make sure that in every walk of life, in every job, in every profession, in every area, we have people that have scientific PhDs. What actually is happening at the moment is that making that decision to go and do that type of work is seen as a failure within academic science. And the quicker we can address that, the more we will find that the public scientific literacy increases, because meeting somebody with a PhD won't be seen as odd and unusual. So we need to encourage more PhD students to go out and do jobs that other people are doing, so that they become more popular and normal in the community, and that will really, really help.
I have a question for the integrity. It seems to me like we had the tendency to forget that science is discussion. And with this speed pressure to publish, basically people are almost like hiding and try to publish first. So it's like a lot of competition, and we forgot the discussion. And science is discussion and not competition. And I have a question for the journals. It gets easier to publish if you have a big name, and everybody knows that. And so let's stop being hypocrite. And a lot of articles published by big names, you can discuss with other small labs. They will say, oh yeah, I tried to repeat this, but I could not. Oh, me too. And nobody published that. But everybody knows that this big paper is actually wrong. But everybody is afraid to say it loudly. And because first, I think the journal will refuse, because it's coming from their journal, their reputation. So all this make a big mess. And I think if we don't discuss from this route, this integrity stuff will never be resolved, I think.
think that comes back to reproducibility and how it's a difficult issue. If you spend all your research funds reproducing something, I mean, you want to do that in order to move on. So there's a certain trust there that somebody has done the work with integrity. But when you can't reproduce something, is science in a way self-correcting because you can show that that isn't reproducible, and then you have to flag those issues, and you have to flag that with the journal, and the journal, you know, if the members of COPE have processes in place to be able to say, okay, we need to consider this, and it might result in a correction or a retraction, and it may have been an honest error, or it may have been outright fraud, who knows, but there has to be a process that happens and is allowed to happen.
Now, I would say that technology is changing a lot of how research errors are discovered. I mean, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. I mean, I'm thinking of PubPeer, for example, Retraction Watch, and other blogs and online resources where people are discussing you know, work that's coming from high-profile labs, and there's often very controversial discussions on whether this figure looks like a copy of this other figure, and so on and so forth. Sometimes that is also used to slander people, and it shouldn't be underestimated that, you know, not every criticism of a paper that comes from a high-profile lab is necessarily valid. You know, both can happen. But so I think we will be seeing, I think, more post-publication peer review in the future of people really making it quite open that they couldn't reproduce a certain result, especially if there's ways of doing that without necessarily immediately revealing your name in fear that the person that you're criticizing might be sitting on the grant panel that you're currently applying to, which is also sometimes an issue.
Very briefly, I think what you said was absolutely right. I agree with what you said. I do think there's a tendency for every type of institution to kind of batten down the hatches if they're criticised, both individual researchers and their teams, and universities and journals. And one thing I've seen throughout the years is journals saying, oh, we're doing loads, I wish the universities would be less defensive, and the universities saying exactly the same about the journals, and the truth's probably somewhere in the middle. Sorry to everyone who works at the university of a journal, I've probably just offended you. But I do think we need to be more open. But the problem is universities could perhaps do more to prioritise replication studies. Journals could do more to find space to publish those studies, and also letters challenging them. And I think, you know, challenging the validity of studies when concerns are raised. We all need to do a bit more, and how we get to that point is challenging. I think it's lots of individual actions and a broader cultural shift.
Hi, sorry, I'm back over here with the mic. Hey. I remember my second question now, and it was basically about how do you protect the individuals who've been caught up in this mess when they're not the ones that have been the problem. Like, if you've got a big collaborative paper, you've got an individual on that paper who's now got their reputation tarnished, but what they did within it isn't the bad stuff, or they just did as they were told effectively without knowing the prior section and things like that.
If it was resulting in a retraction or something like that, it's transparency. So being very clear. Yeah, being very clear about what happened and being very transparent about who was involved, I think, because you're right that it's not necessarily all co-authors on a paper, for example, who may be aware. Yeah. Anything to add to that, James?
Very quickly. I mean, it's a balancing act, because authorship, everyone recognises it's about credit, but it's also about responsibility. So when you're an author on a paper, you're taking collective responsibility for the validity, for the integrity of that research. And that's always been the traditional view. These days, and it's quite common for people to ring us up and say, hello, my paper's been accused of misconduct, I no longer want to be an author, how do I do that? And we go, that's not how it works, sorry. But in such an era of such large collaborations and large teams, is there a limit to how much any one person can say collectively, yes, we knew all this is right? I think it's a balancing act. I think it's going to come down to individual. I think judgment calls can be made on individual teams and individual papers. I do think retraction notices and the reports of misconduct investigations by universities need to be as open as possible in what they say afterwards. And everyone will get tarnished to a certain degree if there's something wrong with your paper, but at least if you're in a position of not having actually been the contributor to that Duff section, you will have something you can point to say, well, yes, collectively we're all at fault, but the investigation, the traction identified these particular bad actors.
Right, I think we've got time for one more question, and then we'll have to move on to the next session, I think. Yeah. Oh, we'll have to.
Just a quick one on James's point about the negative results, which of course are just as valid as positive results. A good way to do this is the Center for Open Science registered reports, where you're peer reviewed on your methods, whatever the output is, say in 2 years' time. But I just want to, I suppose it's mirroring what a few people have said, starting with David, that there is so much pressure to publish. The only currency in the if you like the progress in science is how many papers you published and where you published them. In the end, we love to discuss science. Discussion is obviously great, but you get no brownie points for discussion. You get brownie points for how many papers and where they were published. And if I may, for the second time today, talk about my previous life in science, if you like. I remember you talk about splitting, getting as many papers. I had one paper to publish, and I thought, hang on, I can get 2 papers out of this. Very similar names, but one was reflection holography, one was transmission holography. That was my field. And I published 2 papers. I got 2 papers out of it. Now, did that help understand that principle? No, it didn't. It actually made it more difficult. But I got 2 papers out of it. That's the problem, I feel.
I would. I mean, I'm not going to make myself popular here, but I think as long as scientists rely on their scientific work for their livelihood, there will always be an incentive to game the system. Now, we could change the brownies, and then they will find another way to gain more brownie points, right? I don't want to dismiss the efforts to try and improve the sort of system to reduce the chances of doing really outrageous things, but to some extent we will never entirely fix this until, unless everyone just, has enough money to do whatever they want without it mattering, what comes out at the end. And so the second thing that I was going to say, and that might be controversial, but I mean, I've sat on a few sort of recruitment panels, and if you get a stack like this of CVs, and you potentially have to justify your decision of who to hire to senior people, and how do you go about this? What is your criterion? How do you decide purely based on what people send to you? You can't invite 80 people or 100 people, right? There's not enough time. There is always going to be some criterion that we will use to filter these people. And at the moment, it tends to be, have you published a lot, and have you published a lot in high-impact journals? That at least is a pre-filter. Yeah, I don't have a much better idea of what I would want it to be replaced with in some ways. Not that I'm happy with it, but I just don't know how else to do it.
I think, unfortunately, we do have to recognise there are these parallel drivers in the system. Ideally, we want to do good research. Research organisations want to facilitate that. Editors and publishers want to disseminate that. However, researchers want to keep their jobs and get better jobs. Universities, research organisations want to get lots more lovely grant funding and produce notable research. Editors want to establish or enhance the reputation of their journals, and publishers want profitable journals. And those parallel drivers exist. I think we need to recognise the tensions. They're very nicely encapsulated in that report, and collectively see what we can do to combat them. It's going to be a long slog. I think you're absolutely right. Whenever metrics change, whether they're metrics for researchers, metrics for journals, university rankings, they are always going to be gamed because these things matter. The launch of that report the one organisation that wasn't represented was anyone from Times Higher Education, and perhaps because they weren't there, and this wasn't sort of in the minutes, everyone was decrying the Times Higher University rankings as this scourge on universities, that even some vice-chancellors there were saying, we don't want to have as a strategic objective that we are in the top X rankings of Times Higher and other university ranking systems, but it's kind of incumbent enough to be there, otherwise we don't get students. So I think everyone feels captured by this stuff. We need some collective action. I mean, I don't know if many people from funding agencies are here today, and that's a shame because they have such a big role to play in this. But I think often guidance from funders on research ethics and integrity tends to be, we're setting some standards, researchers, research organisations, editors and publishers need to put those into practice. Funders have a huge influence, and it'd be nice to see them having more involvement in these events and looking back more. And they, like everybody else, will say they're doing a lot, but I think we all can do more to try and combat these pressures and reduce the forces that bear down on the average researcher. At the end of the day, we all have a choice, do we game the system or not? But it can be challenging to make that choice sometimes. Sorry, I'm a bit on my soapbox now. I'll get off.
I think we're there in terms of a great discussion, and I don't think we've got any straightforward answers. But as you can gather, this is a really complex problem. There are no simple solutions. But if there are ways in which we can work together to recognise a researcher for more than the articles they publish, maybe it's also in the fact that they're sharing data, it's in the peer review they do, it's sitting on other committees and boards, it's the mentoring they give their students. Perhaps these are all other ideas that we can look at, but it's going to be interesting to see what the House of Commons comes out with its report in research integrity shortly. Okay, thank you very much for your questions, and thank you to the panellists.